Who was hiding in the bushes? Who led the police on a wild goose chase? And what did the children of Martin Luther King Jr. have to say? More than 50 years later, there are a lot of unanswered questions about the civil rights icon's assassination. When Martin Luther King arrived in Memphis the day before his assassination, the city's police inspector, Don H. Smith, was waiting for him with a four-man security detail in tow. This was unusual because King and his associates hadn't requested a detail, nor did they want one. Nevertheless, Smith and his detail stuck to King like glue. At the Lorraine Motel that evening, Smith called the chief of detectives to ask if he really needed to be there. Smith was told that he could stand down the detail, which he then did, but then nobody bothered to tell King and his people. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reported that the detail's withdrawal was, quote, highly improper. They also determined that it likely wasn't the result of a conspiracy, though it was still a dangerously incompetent decision.
Well, I can't guarantee that there will be no more violence after we leave and go to Washington.
After the security detail left, a detective named Edward Reddit was posted to the firehouse across the road from the Lorraine Motel to keep an eye on King. The only black member of the force working on King's security, Reddit was about to become wrapped up in a mystery of his own. Just 2 hours before the shot rang out, a phone call came into the firehouse from someone threatening to kill the detective. Reddit was then immediately pulled from surveillance duties. In the aftermath of the assassination, Reddit falsely told everyone who would listen that he could have saved King if he'd still been there. Despite the exaggeration, that doesn't change the fact that the mysterious death threat was apparently real and that we still don't know who called it in. Some experts think the disruption it caused could have been a contributing factor to the confused police response. In 1968, there was ample reason to believe that the FBI was not fit to investigate anything involving Martin Luther King. After all, the Bureau had been trying to take him down for years. They tried everything from blackmail to recording evidence of his extramarital affairs to trying to talk him into killing himself.
King is a tomcat with obsessive, degenerate sexual urges.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover hated King, and he didn't care who knew it. As early as 1963, the feds had been wiretapping King for evidence of communist sympathies. This may have been retaliation against a 1962 interview in which King insinuated that white Southerners working at the FBI made the institution untrustworthy. This is all to say that by the time of the assassination, the FBI harbored a deep bias against King. There's no evidence that this means that the Bureau actively plotted to kill him, though it may explain the extraordinary number of leads they refused to follow up after capturing James Earl Ray. One famous photo of King's assassination features members of his entourage pointing up at the building that the bullet came from. However, not everyone is convinced that they're pointing at the right spot. While the official account says that Ray fired his rifle from a window, some witnesses claimed to have seen him in the bushes below. One of those witnesses was Lloyd Jowers, the owner of Jim's Grill on the first floor of the building. He was silent on the matter for about 25 years, but he eventually spoke up in the early 1990s to say that he'd seen a white gunman fire from the bushes. He also claimed that Ray was a scapegoat. And then there's Earl Caldwell's story. A reporter for the New York Times, Caldwell was the only journalist to witness the assassination. He claimed to see a white man leaving the bushes just after the shot rang out. Alas, it was difficult to investigate any of these claims because the very next day, city workers cut all the bushes down, potentially destroying evidence. After the gunshot rang out, Memphis Police Department radio operators didn't put out a request for a roadblock surrounding the Lorraine Motel for 5 whole minutes. That's plenty of time for an assassin to escape, which is exactly what James Earl Ray did. By the time the 2 blocks around the Lorraine were cordoned off, he was already in his car on his way out of the city. Even after local police were finally alerted to Ray's white Ford Mustang getaway car, no one bothered to tell police in neighboring states. This allowed Ray to head south into Mississippi before driving all the way to Georgia, where his car was found abandoned. He wouldn't be apprehended until 2 months later when British police arrested him in London's Heathrow Airport. On top of all of this, MPD units that could have helped in the manhunt were instead diverted to crack down on protesters who flooded the streets after the assassination.
The city is under attack.
Despite all the incompetence on display, law enforcement eventually managed to catch a lucky break, or so it seemed. 3 witnesses saw Ray's white Ford Mustang leaving the scene and pursued him in their Pontiac. One of them had a citizen's radio, and they proceeded to broadcast their chase. As they left the city, the Pontiac hit 110 miles per hour while the 2 cars barreled through red lights. 15 miles north of Memphis, someone in the Mustang opened fire on the Pontiac. Naturally, The MPD scrambled a fleet of squad cars in pursuit of this high-speed chase. If this all sounds impossible, there's a good reason for that. It was complete fiction. The supposed vigilante was making up the whole story as he went along, and the geography wasn't even right. As the MPD raced north, Ray was heading south, quietly slipping across the Mississippi border. To this day, nobody's ever managed to identify the broadcaster or determine their motive. They could have been simply pranking the cops, or perhaps they were deliberately diverting police resources away from Ray's real escape route. Even though James Earl Ray lived for another 30 years after the assassination, we never really learned his motive, which may have been only tangentially related to skin color. For most of his life, Ray maintained his innocence, but that didn't stop the speculation. One clue was his ultimate destination, as he was headed to the former African country of Rhodesia, which was then a white supremacist state. Thus, it was assumed Ray was similarly obsessed with race. However, the House Select Committee on Assassinations didn't buy this motive. Instead, they uncovered evidence that a group of staffers for Alabama Governor George Wallace may have conspired to raise funds for King's assassination. They hypothesized that the penniless Ray may have learned of the group and committed the killing in hopes of claiming the bounty. Alas, this lead could not be followed up on. By the time of the HSCA report, nearly everyone on the Wallace campaign was dead. One of the most intriguing things about the House Select Committee report is how few of their potentially explosive conclusions were followed up on. In 1978, the committee concluded that there was a decent chance that there was a conspiracy to kill King, but it didn't involve the FBI. Instead, it was likely between James Earl Ray and his family. John and Jerry Ray both lied to investigations about their dealings with their brother in the months before the shooting. They claimed to have had no contact with him for years, despite evidence that they'd planned and conducted bank robberies as a way of funding their fugitive sibling, who had escaped from jail in 1967. Even more damningly, the committee found evidence that Ray had contacted at least one of his brothers in the run-up to the shooting, and may have even gone with them to buy his rifle.
What were you doing with a rifle that day?
A project with a guy named Raoul for about 8 or 9 months.
HSCA also found evidence of Ray's brothers working for the same George Wallace campaign, where staffers allegedly raised a bounty to have King killed. James Earl Ray confessed to killing King at trial, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But Ray also famously protested that he was innocent and went to his grave claiming that he'd been railroaded. When the time came to enter his plea, he chose guilty, but it took less than 3 days for him to once again say the opposite. Rather than the catharsis of evidence and testimony, the country had to settle for a confession, only for that confession to immediately be retracted. Yet Ray's case never went to retrial, despite all the committee hearings and reviews over the next 3 decades. Ray claimed that he'd been tricked into his guilty plea by his lawyer, who wanted him to avoid the death penalty. It's also possible that he was simply aware of what it would take to save himself. Considering that James Earl Ray maintained his innocence for so long, it shouldn't be too surprising to learn that some people actually believed him. But what is surprising is that the family of the man he was convicted of murdering are among those who believed him. Indeed, by the 1990s, the vast majority of King's family believed that he was framed. And even in the decades after Ray's death, some of King's children continued to advocate for his innocence. In March 1997, as Ray lay in the hospital dying of liver disease, MLK's son Dexter King arranged an on-camera meeting between the two of them. When Dexter asked if Ray had killed his father and Ray said no, Dexter replied that he believed him, and so did his family.
I believe him because there's so much new evidence that has been presented to me and my family vis-a-vis his attorney, Bill Pepper.
Then in 1999, King's family filed a civil lawsuit seeking a symbolic $100 in damages. This ended in a sensational trial during which Ray was declared innocent and the government and others were declared liable for King's death. Since this was just a civil trial, the Department of Justice was quick to point out that Ray was still officially considered guilty. An 18-month DOJ investigation also concluded that no conspiracy existed. On September 30th, 1962, the town of Oxford, Mississippi exploded. Angry at the enrollment of a black student named James Meredith at the University of Mississippi, white supremacists organized a riot that killed 2 people and put 300 in the hospital. In a subsequent investigation, a name that made it onto the FBI's radar was J.C. Hardin, an alias for a white supremacist named James Ashmore. Fast forward to March 1968, when an angry James Earl Ray was at the St. Francis Hotel in Los Angeles a month before he would kill Martin Luther King. It was at this point that he started being repeatedly contacted by Hardin. In the aftermath of King's shooting, the FBI interviewed St. Francis manager Alan O. Thompson, who provided information that linked Ashmore to the mysterious Hardin. What's especially puzzling is why the FBI failed to follow up on the connection between Hardin and Ashmore. Despite Thompson's statement, the Bureau decided that Ashmore and Hardin must be different people since they had different haircuts. So the link was never investigated, and Ashmore died in 1973. In 1977, just as the House Select Committee on Assassinations was getting underway, a court order sealed the FBI's surveillance records on Martin Luther King Jr. for 50 years. These sealed files include FBI wiretap transcripts. It's been public knowledge for a long time that the Bureau believed it had evidence of King's extramarital affairs, but other details will likely be more embarrassing to the FBI than to King. For example, a file declassified in 2017 was full of paranoid ravings by agents claiming that every single thing King said was vetted by the Communist Party. And there's always the chance that the files could contain even more explosive revelations. Evidence of a grand conspiracy seems unlikely, although documents relating to J.C. Hardin or the alleged shooter in the bushes certainly don't feel outside the realm of possibility.